building code violations, FEMA violations, and flood zones. Those are all issues that concern flood activist Dr. Ana Zimmerman. I talked to her one-on-one for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and like Quintin's Close-Ups on Facebook. Dr. Anastasia Zimmerman, welcome to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Obviously, you are an associate professor here at the College of Charleston in the Department of Biography. And I understand that you are really a national flood activist when it comes to flooding. How do you describe Dr. Zimmerman these days?
Well, you know, I'm a mom first and a teacher second. I have a teenager and I teach at the College of Charleston. I teach immunology, and through a weird series of events, yes, I've become a national flood activist.
What are those weird series of events that are still in your mind right now?
Well, in 2015, our house flooded during the 1,000-year flood. So we rebuilt our house, and then just 2 short years later, during Hurricane Irma, our house flooded again. And so this led me to looking to find solutions. And those solutions might have been tearing down our house, elevating our house, and basically it set me looking for solutions. And what I uncovered, which was very surprising to me, is that basically my house was destined to flood. And my house was built 3 feet below federal regulations in a floodplain. And then I found out that this is actually illegal and that my house didn't have a accurate certificate of occupancy. All of this should have been avoided. My house had never had been deemed by the city to have flooded. And so really it sent me on this. There were so many problems with my house that I couldn't possibly sell my house to someone else. And then it just turned out it wasn't my house, it was my entire street. And it just snowballed from there with all of these violations. And really, through this entire thing, I've just been trying to find solutions for the people that lived on the street that I lived on. And also, there are a lot of people that are in harm's way in Charleston that they're living the same situation. They just don't know it yet.
What are those violations that a lot of homeowners in Charleston don't know about?
Yes, so the violations, and we have our clock ringing down here. The violations are that the City of Charleston, when a house is constructed and built, it has to be in compliance with the flood maps of the National Flood Insurance Program. And this wasn't done in some neighborhoods in Charleston. And so in Charleston, a lot of the property that was annexed is very low lands. And to allow builders to build houses too low actually is in violation of the National Flood Insurance Program. Another violation that we found, which was very startling, is that it is a requirement of FEMA that cities that have residents that are insured with FEMA, that anytime that there is a flood, the city has to do inspections of those flooded homes and make a record of those floods. And the City of Charleston had not been doing that. If a house has sustained 50% the damage of the structure, it's called substantially damaged. And those houses are supposed to be tagged with something called a substantial damage letter. So in my case, my house should have been tagged far before I ever bought it, and that should have been available to me. But since the city wasn't following those requirements, we actually have hundreds of people that have moved into homes without accurate flood disclosure.
A couple of questions, Dr. Zimmerman. What were those not violations, but how many inspections that have the city missed in your mind?
Oh, in my mind, they missed over 45 inspections on my street alone. And these are not just problems that are going on James Island. They didn't do inspections of all the flooded homes that happened downtown. They didn't do inspections of the flooded homes out at West Ashley. And this is something that the city has been required to do since Hugo. Many of the houses that were damaged in Hugo should have been mitigated and elevated after Hugo. They should have never been rebuilt to the current elevation that they're at. And then in the past 3.5 years, has been the most blatant violations because the city has been informed that they have to do these inspections and they don't do them. Even back in 2020 of April, my house flooded and the city refuses to do an inspection, even though I have told them this is federal law, and they just refuse to do it.
And who were they mandated to do this by? FEMA?
They're mandated by federal building codes, and they're mandated by the National Flood Insurance Program and FEMA. And the city has been sent letters that currently we're in a precarious position in the city, in that FEMA is looking to put the city on probation or possibly even suspend the city from the National Flood Insurance Program. Some serious violations that are going on, and we really need to rectify those and mitigate these things and fix those as soon as possible, because really it is putting in jeopardy every house that has a federally backed mortgage in the city of Charleston.
Have you been able to talk to this current mayor about these inspections and these violations and these building codes?
I have tried. I've gone to city council. I've emailed him. This mayor, he makes his priorities clear, and this with FEMA, I don't understand it. I don't understand why this wouldn't be at the forefront of, he doesn't share these letters from FEMA with city council. So, his priorities, when somebody shows you what their priorities are, I guess we should just believe them. But in the meantime, there are a lot of families that have suffered due to this. I mean, my own family, it's been financially quite devastating. We lost our house. But I think that my family, in many ways, is like a canary in the coal mine, in that more people are going to end up suffering. More people, because these inspections haven't been done, are going to find themselves mortgaging themselves into situations where their houses are filled with mold. They had flooding, but it wasn't disclosed to them. And, if he wanted to, the mayor could have fixed Shortham Road 2.5 years ago when I went to him with these violations, but it's not his priority.
Now, let me ask you this, Dr. Zimmerman. When did those inspections stop with the city? You've been here since 2005. When did it stop in your mind?
Well, I went back to records from, I requested all the permits in my neighborhood back since 1987, and there were problems as early as the 90s, but it really has been the last couple of years where we've had these repetitive properties that once a house floods multiple times, it goes into a whole different ballgame with FEMA about what the inspections, substantial damage letters. So the violations that FEMA has been looking at are things that really are in the last 3.5 years.
Last 3 years?
Yes.
Now, were you able to talk to any of the city council members about this, since apparently the mayor is not sharing information allegedly with the city council members?
Yes, I have. And so the city council member on James Island, Carol Jackson, I have spoken with her. I have spoken with Harry Griffin. I've gone to city council. There seems to be, I don't want to speak ill of people, but it's not their priority. The priority is not on existing homeowners. The priority really is on development. I wish I could say that, one of them had been helpful. I think that there are many on city council that know that there is a problem. They know that there are FEMA violations. They're not sure how to deal with them. And when, I'll just be blunt, when the mayor is not going to deal with them, what are they going to do?
Let me ask you this, Dr. Zimmerman. Any low participation rates or inadequate flood control infrastructure or debt service costs or any contractor properties that ring alarm in your mind right now?
Yes, so I think that one of the things that the city could do, and there are a lot of citizens that are very concerned about how our city is going. We have, I work at the College of Charleston. We have ecologists like Bill Dustin is a good friend of mine. Many people in the community are very concerned about flooding. Engineers, we've sat around and we've talked about things. And, one of the things that is rampant in Charleston right now is building. And a lot of that building is happening on low lands. And what is happening in the city is that they're filling in wetlands. And this is actually exacerbating flooding. When we have all this discussion about we have to, deal with flooding, one of the worst things that we can do is put dirt into wet spaces. And so we had, talked about different ways, what would be the easiest thing that the city could do. And we came up with follow existing federal requirements and ban fill and build. Ban fill and build would be the single most effective way to stop some of the flooding that's going on. I mean, if you've gone over to Central Park, this is a disaster in the making. People have flooding in their houses already, and they're putting more dirt and they're building more houses. So you end up with a situation that, if you buy your house and then the next person puts dirt up here and now your house is going to flood, the existing homeowner has a problem. But what's also happening with the fill dirt that's being added is FEMA's changing the rules of the game, and FEMA's changing flood insurance. And no longer is it just going to be based on flood maps. So basically every neighborhood that's adjacent to a neighborhood that has been built higher, their flood insurance is going to go up with risk rating 2.0. So we have thousands of people in the city of Charleston that due to fill and build, it's going to hurt existing homeowners.
Why do you think that fill and build is always being deferred?
Because it does have a cost to one segment of society, and that is the developers. And the developers, their entire process is to make money, not to design sustainable neighborhoods. And so it keeps getting deferred. I don't understand it. After Hurricane Sandy in New Jersey banned this practice, had full support. And when we talk to folks in New Jersey, they can't believe that the city of Charleston allows this to continue to happen. So your guess is as good as mine of why it keeps being deferred.
And let me go to flood disclosure. You talked about that earlier. How do you locate accurate flood histories of homes with a federal privacy law in place?
Yes, so the federal privacy law is that you cannot get information about other people's property. And this is a little bit of a problem when you're trying to buy a house. What is available to the public are previous flood claims. So you can actually see if someone has filed a previous flood claim. Also, there are disclosure laws in the state of South Carolina that the seller would present a disclosure. And some of the questions on the disclosure deal with flooding, illegal variances, these sorts of things. And it's up to the real estate agent and the seller to disclose what they know. However, there's no enforcement for that. But it shouldn't really be left up to the seller and the real estate agent, because often the real estate agent has come in, they don't have any knowledge of the history, and they're willing to put in no knowledge. And that's as far as the flood disclosure goes. However, FEMA realizes that and has a system already in place. And that is that when a house floods, the city is to make a record of that. The city, if it has repetitively flooded, is supposed to come up with a plan to mitigate those structures. The city is supposed to attach substantial damage letters to the deeds of these homes. If the city would attach these substantial damage letters, the county does it, the town of Mount Pleasant does it, Folly Beach does it, then when somebody ran a title search, this would come up. So in my particular situation, a title search came up clean for my house, and my house had flooded 5 times prior to us purchasing it. And we didn't find that out until we tracked down all of the previous homeowners. So the rules are already there, and there's a lot of talk about how flood disclosure needs to be changed, needs to be better, and really we wouldn't have a lot of the problems that we had if these inspections had taken place with these houses and if substantial damage letters had been issued.
With those damage letters, what exactly should it look like, and why do you think the city is holding out on it?
So what it should look like, my house is the first substantial damage letter in the entire city of Charleston, and I find this unbelievable to me. that with all the flooding that's gone on, my house is the first one. You know, we had some folks from New Jersey come down to talk to us about flooding, and they were astounded, given that after Sandy, there were thousands of substantial damage letters. That was the thing that when I gave a talk at a national flood meeting, people could not believe that the city of Charleston wasn't issuing substantial damage letters. What it looks like is a letter that says this house has been flooded, this house has been deemed to have damaged 50% the value of the structure, and that you have to bring the house up to code in your repairs. So that's what it looks like. I know exactly what it looks like because the previous floodplain manager in Charleston wrote such a letter to me, for me, and FEMA gave me a template of what that letter should look like. So, yeah, I mean, other cities do this. They could have asked the county to issue these. Why they haven't been done, you know, I actually asked city officials, why have you not done this? And they said it was intentional because they said something to the guys of they don't have the staff to do this, and really what would happen is a lot of people would lose their homes.
When you look at the current FEMA flood map, what Charleston area is high risk and what area is low risk?
So a lot of Charleston is in flood zones. And so, you know, if you take my house, for example, that was 1171 Shoreham Road, if I looked at a flood map, it would say that the base flood elevation of houses there have to be built at 12 feet, okay? My house was actually built at 9 feet, so even if I looked at a flood map, I would have made the assumption that my house was built to code. It was never built to code. So it's really tough right now, I think, in the city of Charleston, knowing that some of the neighborhoods are not at the accurate elevations, to know that, you know.
What are those accurate levels of inclinations, I guess?
So my house was supposed to be at 12 feet, and the entire road has houses at below 9.
Okay.
So they're 3 feet too low. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that if your house is 3 feet too low, that had building codes been followed, that it never would have flooded.
And in your mind, Dr. Zimmerman, is the flood risk binary?
Is the flood risk, excuse me?
Is it binary? Binary?
Like either it's you flood or you don't flood?
Yes, ma'am.
I think that some houses, what we're seeing in Charleston is a lot of houses that have been around for decades are now flooding. And there's, you know, obviously some reasons for that. There's sea level rise is happening, but also we're creating a tremendous amount of impervious surface all over this city. And so when you put all of this concrete jungle out there, you destroy wetlands, you fill in the wetlands, you put impervious surfaces like parking lots everywhere, that water has to go somewhere. And where it's going in many cases are to the lowest areas. So when you have houses sitting in those lowest areas, it is problematic. Also, many of the houses in Charleston are slab on grade, which means that they're built with concrete slab foundation. And those houses are really expensive to raise. In the case of my house, which we bought this house for under $200,000, to raise the house or elevate it was estimated to be over $180,000.
Let me ask you this too, Dr. Zimmerman. In your mind, are some of the FEMA flood maps inaccurate or out of date?
Well, I think that, you know, a lot of things are obviously, they're going to be outdated as soon as they come about because cities are constantly developing, patterns are changing. I think in the case of Charleston that a lot of the problems that are going on are not FEMA's issues. It's not the issues with the flood maps. If the city had followed federal guidelines, federal mandates with the neighborhood that I lived in, we wouldn't have had a flooding problem. You know, the substantial damage letters, the lack of disclosure. If I look up my house, and I can be blunt, I've looked up my house to get the plats at the city deeds office. The city has the wrong elevations. So there's a reason that there's been a federal investigation into the city of Charleston and why my house was ensnared in that investigation.
Is that investigation ongoing?
The last time that I talked to the FEMA investigator was probably 3 weeks ago. They're still collecting data about the surveys in my neighborhood, yes. And I've had hundreds of email conversations with federal investigators. You know, I'm a scientist. The truth is the truth.
Right.
And the data is the data. And it doesn't matter what my personality is or the mayor's personality is or the city council member's personality is. We have a problem in Charleston and it needs to be addressed. And it's unfortunate that it hasn't been addressed at the local level. And, you know, perhaps it will be addressed at the federal level. But the data is the data.
And let me ask you this too, Doctor. The National Flood Insurance Program violations and the FEMA violations, what are those totals here in Charleston?
What are those totals in Charleston?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, there are over 600 houses that were not inspected after floods. And so the city has been cited for that. The elevation problems have been established with some of these houses. And the city for the past, they've known about this, it will be coming up on 2 years, was the first time that they were alerted by the federal government of these problems. The city has just requested delay after delay after delay after delay of their plan for how they're going to mitigate these problems.
And with those delays, how does that change the data or the survey that you have been getting really, actually?
Well, you know, how that changes things is we did have a flood in April, and the street that I lived on had flooded houses. The city was still not inspecting them. The problems aren't going to go away. No matter what I say about that street, it's still there. It's still a problem. The elevations are wrong. The plats are wrong. The deeds say that the houses aren't in a flood zone. You know, FEMA knows what these violations are. I guess, you know, FEMA has a couple ways that they can act. And if they do act, that can be to the detriment of all of us that live here in the city. But right now, that the city won't act is a detriment to many families. And there are people that are buying houses that are filled with mold. And children are getting sick. My own child was diagnosed with mold allergies from living in a house that the walls, when I cut open the walls and looked inside, there's black mold everywhere.
Let me ask you this too. If you, by chance, have those firm built-in code violations, what are the typical insurance rates?
So my insurance for my house and many of my neighbors people were paying around $600 a year for flood insurance, but I gave FEMA the actual real data of what my elevation was, and my insurance rates went up to $7,000 a year. So if FEMA decides to act and comes in and looks at the elevation certificates, and they are asking people to submit elevation certificates now, that wasn't something that was always done. What's going to happen, I think, is we're going to have foreclosure after foreclosure after foreclosure in this city, and this all could have been avoided if, you know, the city had followed these federal mandates. And there are places like Livingston Parish in Louisiana that have been kicked out of the CRS, where everybody's flood insurance rates go up. And I think the city is playing a dangerous game by thinking that they don't have to fix these things, that they're not going away. And, you know, I've had calls from the Department of Homeland Security, I've had calls from federal fraud investigators, and I'm just, you know, a person that happens to have a house that people have really looked at that street and my house and the way that FEMA has done things, and I just want solutions. And I wish that the city would be more proactive towards their solutions and admit that there are some problem areas. You know, some other cities that have had FEMA violations, their city council has actually voted to invite FEMA in to look at what the problems are and deal with them, where for whatever reason, our city council doesn't even discuss these violations that are going on. And I wish that, you know, our city would take a look at what can we do to deal with some of these violations and make sure that they never, ever happen again. Because no family should ever go through their child getting sick from a house that's filled with mold when the house is flooded. I mean, there are houses for sale in this town that have flooded over 9 times. And I have the data because I have FOIA requested it from the federal government. I have contacted real estate agents that are selling these houses, and the real estate agents tell me, well, the house doesn't flood. And then I give them the documentation and I never hear from them again. And then I see that the house sold without disclosure. And so, you know, we could say, well, let's crack down on every real estate agent in town and every family that is trying to do unto others what was done unto them, or the city could take care of these problems, because the buck really stops at the city, the deeds office, the planning department. They are supposed to, by law, have those records. And if the city is not collecting the data, the problem is just going to get worse as time goes on.
You talked earlier about foreclosures. How many have those happened in the past 2 years because of the city's violations and non-compliances?
Well, we let our house go into foreclosure to make an example of it. And I went to every foreclosure hearing and talked to the judge, and I disclosed to everyone who was bidding on this house that this property is a multiple repetitive loss structure. I know that on my street there were 4 foreclosures that ended up happening. But what ends up happening is people buy the house at a foreclosure, they fix it up, they flip it. I mean, there's money to be made, and who ends up getting stuck with the bill are new families. And there's no amount of due diligence that you can do in the city of Charleston to find out the history of your house if the city hasn't kept accurate records.
Why isn't there a national flood disclosure law in your mind?
Well, the national flood disclosure laws, there is a national mandate that houses that have repetitively flooded have to be in the jurisdiction's reports to FEMA, and there is a substantial damage rule. And so in a way that would only catch properties that have had serious damage. However, seriously damaged houses that are being flipped from one person to the other is costing the federal taxpayer an unbelievable amount of money, unbelievable. So in theory, yes, we should maybe have a flood disclosure law, but any national flood disclosure law, when it's not connected to the city jurisdiction, there will be problems, because over the lifetime of a home, if a home has existed for 35 years, people don't know what the history is. That's why there's supposed to be a documented history at the jurisdiction level of, like, the city of Charleston. You should be able to run a title search and find those things. And in other cities, you can.
Absolutely. And how many repeat flood losses have been reported in Charleston over the past 10 years?
Well, I know that there's over 600 violations of repetitive lost properties that FEMA has tagged in Charleston. And some of those houses are currently for sale right now without disclosure of flooding.
And let me ask you about equity considerations in the floodplain management. What consideration stands out in your mind, and how many of those equity considerations has the city considered?
So the city of Charleston, you know, like many other cities, the people that are going to be affected the most by flooding are the most vulnerable in our society. And for many people, you know, if your house floods, you can fix it up and sell it and get rid of it. But for a lot of people, that's not so easy to get out of that situation. And so the city has made a concerted effort to, when flood mitigation money comes in, you know, they could have easily used some of this money to deal with the street that I lived on that had 5 sets of grandparents, single moms, white families, black families, you know, grandparents raising children, their grandchildren. They could have done that, but instead, you know, the pattern that we're seeing, I mean, the last couple of grants that the city has put in for flood mitigation have been investors' rental properties in the city of Charleston to elevate these million-dollar homes. So, I mean, the priorities, when people show you what their priorities are, you should believe them.
Have you been able to have any discussions with the Dutch Dialogues officials?
Yes, actually, I just had an email from Dale Morris a couple weeks ago. They watched my presentation at the National Flood Managers meeting, and yeah, I think it's, you know, people do a Google search of Charleston and flooding, and somehow my name keeps coming up. So I've had the New York Times contact me. I've had the Washington Post contact me. You know, recently the National Office for Public Integrity contacted me. You know, I've talked to the Dutch Dialogues folks. We were on the same show at the Soledad O'Brien, MSNBC. We were both interviewed on that show. And there seems to be, you know, people, they call us because something doesn't jive with what they're being told at the level, at other levels in the city. So, you know, I think scientists in general are going to be a population of people that, you know, here's the data, this is what it is. You know, I don't have an agenda with development in the city of Charleston. You know, if the Dutch Dialogues do a series of studies and they say you should not be filling in wetlands, maybe we should look at that, not come up with excuses of, you know, why we can't do that.
And I meant to ask you this earlier in the interview, but let me ask you this. How many federal taxes have been used for post-farm building violations?
Oh, actually, so on my street alone, the federal taxpayers have been pouring in, it's poured in over $1 million. It's been millions of dollars into the city of Charleston. And that's why the federal government is looking into this, because this cannot continue. You cannot have people in Kansas paying for building code violations. And that's what the city, I mean, I'll be blunt. The mayor told me that nothing will be done for Shoreham Road unless FEMA pays for it. And that's a really risky scenario to put forth, that the federal government, the federal taxpayers should pay for building code violations.
What scenarios next? What do you see coming next?
What do I see coming next? I think that, you know, some of these investigations, the federal government doesn't spend 2 years investigating things to have no response. I see at the level of Charleston, you know, sooner or later we're going to have to deal with some of these problems. It's unfortunate that we didn't deal with them sooner. It's unfortunate. We have to admit that there's some problems here. Until there's federal sanctions on this city, I really, you know, I think left to its own devices, the city's not going to help itself out of this problem. So what do I see next? I see that, you know, we're going to have more flooded people in hurricane season. The city at that point will be able to make a choice. Do we follow the regulations or not follow the regulations? The status quo, it's not working. It's not working for many of the families that live here in Charleston. It's not working for any families that are buying in Charleston. You know, the word's going to get out. The word already is getting out. I mean, Charleston is, in many of the flood circles, you know, being discussed as the beacon of incompetence. And, you know, we could do better. We should do better. People deserve better.
Dr. Ana Zimmerman, thank you so much for your time. And again, welcome to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.